Today, Chongqing hot pot is a symbol of gathering, laughter, and shared meals. But over a century ago, this style of eating wasn't about culinary pleasure or socializing. It was a survival strategy for the working poor. So, how did the humble working-class survival food evolve into one of China's most popular ways to eat together? What exactly changed? Let's find out. Let's take a look back at the late 19th century. After a series of military defeats, the Qing government was forced to further open inland regions to foreign powers. On the 1st of March 1891, the Chongqing Custom House was officially established. Chongqing, already a critical hub on the upper Yangtze River, became the first inland treaty port in western China. More cargo ships and goods began arriving, and with them came a massive wave of migrant laborers looking for a livelihood. Among them, the hardest lives belonged to the trackers, porters, and dock workers. These men worked barefoot, hauling heavy loads over slick, freezing river stones. Their shoulders were calloused from coarse hemp ropes, and their bodies were constantly soaked in the river water. For them, eating was never about enjoyment, it was about restoring enough strength to keep working. Their checklist was simple. It had to be cheap, fast, packed with calories, and warm enough to fight the cold. Prime cuts of meat were completely out of reach. All they could afford were the less desirable parts of the animal tripe, liver, and intestines. Today, however, beef offal is anything but cheap in China. So why were they considered so cheap a century ago? As the region's largest river shipping hub, cattle from across southwest China were brought to Chongqing for trade and slaughter. Every day, large numbers of cattle were slaughtered in the slaughterhouses near the docks. Without effective methods of preservation, organ meats spoiled quickly and developed a strong odor. If not cleaned properly, they also retained an unpleasant taste and smell. Back then, few people had the patience to clean them, and the demand was limited. They could be bought for almost nothing, and were sometimes even given away. You might wonder, why not pork offal? Because at the time, China didn't have the kind of large-scale pig farming industry it has today. Most rural families raised only 1 or 2 pigs a year. That pig was a household's entire yearly supply of fat and the centerpiece for the Lunar New Year. Every single scrap of it was precious. So beef offal was the cheap option, but cooking each portion separately would actually cost more. Was there a way to solve all these challenges at once? There was. Put all the offal into one large pot with plenty of beef tallow, salt, Sichuan peppercorns, and chilies. The bold spices masked the smell, allowing all the offal to be cooked together in a single pot. The next question was, how could they sell this meal to poor dock workers? If a vendor tried to sell an entire pot of hot broth and offal to a single worker, it would have been far beyond their budget. And selling it pre-cooked by the bowl ran the risk of food waste if business was slow. So the vendors came up with a simple solution. They weren't selling the beef offal. They were selling the right to use the broth. The meat runs out, but the broth keeps simmering, ready to serve the next customer and the next. In a scarcity economy, spices and salt were expensive commodities, and rendering beef tallow required serious time and fuel. That boiling red broth represented a huge investment of spices, tallow, time, and fuel. Vendors couldn't afford to treat it as a single-use disposable item. In short, the real value wasn't the food, it was the broth itself, kept simmering continuously. If the broth was the expensive part, what was the most cost-effective way to serve it? How could they make the most money from it? By skimping on spices? Or cutting back on tallow? Neither. The best way to increase profits was simple. Let more people share the same pot. Thus, a simple but clever business model was born. Vendors had workers gather around the same shared pot. To eat, a worker only had to pay a small amount for a plate of sliced raw offal, dip it into the shared pot with their own chopsticks, and cook it on the spot. They paid only for the portion of raw offal they bought. It was affordable for the laborers and highly profitable for the vendors. But when strangers are gathered around the same pot, whose food is whose? Once it drops into the soup, how do you track it? To prevent chaos, vendors started using wooden slats, bamboo dividers, and eventually metal grids to partition the pot into distinct zones. Everyone had their own section of the pot. They shared the broth, but they didn't have to fight over the food. Over time, this simple solution evolved into the most iconic feature of Chongqing hot pot, the 9-grid layout. Today, many people think the 9 grids are for precision temperature control, but many believe it originally appeared as a practical way to prevent confusion and conflict among strangers sharing one pot. The idea of different heat zones was something people came to understand much later. The center grid, where the heat is strongest, is perfect for quickly cooking ingredients like tripe that are best eaten crisp. The 4 grids surrounding the center offer a steady, medium simmer, ideal for poaching meatballs that need time to absorb the flavors. And the 4 quiet corners have the gentlest heat, perfect for gently cooking delicate ingredients like duck blood or tofu without breaking them apart. What began as a simple way to keep people from mixing up their food eventually became a guide to cooking different ingredients. So how did this humble, working-class survival food break out of the waterfront docks and capture the entire city? In 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out. As the front line shifted, the national government relocated inland, turning Chongqing into the country's wartime capital. Government agencies, universities, and factories relocated en masse. Within just a few years, people from all over China flooded into this mountain city. Under normal circumstances, wartime displacement doesn't elevate a cuisine. Yet, this was the exact moment Chongqing hot pot broke into the mainstream. You might assume that more mouths simply meant more business. But why did this specific dockside format win out over other local street foods? Don't forget, Chongqing hot pot back then was still made mainly with beef offal. To many newcomers from other parts of China, these ingredients weren't considered proper food. Some people didn't even want to eat them. But the wartime population explosion put a massive strain on housing, logistics, and the food supplies. If you were a displaced refugee, you didn't need high-end regional cuisine. You needed a meal that was hot, cheap, and available right away. Furthermore, in a city under constant air raids, a meal that requires zero complex kitchen prep, minimal fuel, and could trigger a sweat to clear out the damp, chilly mountain air was the perfect survival food. For the first time, this dockside meal was no longer just for dock workers. It began serving the whole city. Around the pot now sat students, merchants, government employees, and migrants from all over China. And not all of them had a taste for organ meats. So what did they do? Chongqing hot pot began to change. Beyond offal, they introduced the sliced beef, duck intestines, tofu, and fresh greens. The dockside hot pot evolved into a style of dining where almost anything could be cooked. But as the clientele diversified, how could one single soup base satisfy a room full of wildly different regional palates? This forced the broth itself to evolve. It was no longer just meant to mask the strong smell of offal. It began to work with more kinds of ingredients and suit more people's tastes. Even so, a single flavor profile could never please everyone in a country with such diverse food cultures. Eventually, people realized that the broth's job was simply to bring everyone to the same table. The final flavor was left for each diner to decide. One person loads up on minced garlic. Another douses their bowl in toasted sesame oil. Someone else cranks up the chili. Hot pot proved that A meal doesn't have to satisfy everyone's taste to bring people together. When the war ended, government offices packed up and the wartime population gradually dispersed. The people who had sought refuge in Chongqing headed back home. By all logic, hot pot should have receded back to the river docks, but it didn't. Because by then, it was no longer just a cheap offal soup for laborers. It had become a shared meal embraced by ordinary urban residents. Yet, Chongqing didn't hold a monopoly on hot pot in China. Beijing had its copper pot mutton, Yunnan had its wild mushroom broths, Canton had its delicate seafood hot pot. So why was it Chongqing's version that conquered the entire nation? From a business perspective, what allows a regional dish to go national isn't how delicious it is, it's how easily it can be standardized and replicated. In the 1980s, China's economic opening triggered the largest internal migration in Chinese history. Millions left their rural hometowns for booming, unfamiliar cities. This massive demographic shift created an unprecedented restaurant market. Faced with this massive market opportunity, what was Chongqing hot pot's secret weapon that allowed it to break through regional barriers and dominate the country? As Chongqing hot pot spread across China, it solved the problem that traditional Chinese cooking had struggled with for generations. In classic Chinese culinary arts, the biggest challenge is dependency on the chef's technical skill, flame control, knife work, intuitive seasoning. If any variable is slightly off, the dish fails. Chongqing hot pot solved this problem in a completely different way. It took the most difficult part of flavor and packed it into a standardized soup base. With this standardized soup base, whether you open a location in Lhasa or Shanghai, and no matter who is cooking, you can produce a flavor that's close to what you'd find in Chongqing. Furthermore, while the soup base anchored the identity, there were almost no limits on what people could cook in it. Restaurants in northern China could serve more beef and lamb, while restaurants along the coast could add all kinds of seafood. On the surface, Chongqing was exporting a soup base, but what it was really exporting was a complete business model that could be replicated again and again. But being easy to copy doesn't guarantee lasting popularity. What truly made Chongqing hot pot different wasn't the kitchen, it was the dining table. As Chongqing hot pot swept across the country, it wasn't just spreading a flavor profile, it was introducing a new way of eating together. Strangely enough, this way of eating should have been less convenient. The diner has to manage the cooking times, track the ingredients, and pull them out at the exact right second. It seems wildly inefficient. But ultimately, it wasn't about changing the cooking itself. It changed the way people share the meal together. Drop it in, wait, warn each other, pull it out. Every few dozen seconds, the cycle begins again. Suddenly, everyone's attention turns to the same pot. Someone yells, "The tripe is ready." Another warns, "Don't overcook the duck intestines." Someone reaches into the pot, picks up a slice of beef that's just cooked, and drops it into someone else's bowl. A meal becomes an ongoing interaction. Looking back, the problems Chongqing hot pot had to solve kept shifting across generations. At first, it solved a simple problem: how to fill people's stomachs. Then it became an exercise in cost efficiency. Later, it became a way to bring more people to the same table. Today, people no longer rely on a pot of hot pot simply to fill their stomachs. Yet, we are more than willing to spend hours huddled around the same pot, waiting together. Today, what has become scarce is not food, but the experience of eating together. A way of eating that turns strangers into acquaintances, keeps friends talking longer, and makes families stay at the table just a little while longer.